There was a time when the world seemed simpler, when the hum of a car engine and the laughter of children in a front yard could make a neighborhood feel alive. The 1950s in America were an age of growth and optimism. The war was over. The economy was booming, and for millions of families, life felt full of promise. New homes sprouted across the suburbs, rows of pastel-colored houses with white fences and neatly trimmed lawns. Television sets flickered in living rooms, broadcasting black and white visions of perfect families and endless smiles. For many, this was the American dream: steady jobs, home ownership, a shiny car in the driveway. Cars were freedom on four wheels. They symbolized everything Americans wanted to believe about themselves: independence, progress, confidence. Seatbelts weren't standard yet, and safety wasn't something people talked about. Kids stood up in the back seats, waving out the windows, their parents trusting instinct more than any rule book. On Sunday afternoons, families would pile in and drive with no destination. Just the open road, a full tank of gas, and the sound of the radio humming along. Life moved slower then. People fixed their own cars in the driveway, changed their own oil, and thought little about where it went afterward. Environmental awareness hadn't yet entered the conversation. What mattered most was keeping things running: your car, your home, your family. In towns across the country, community life thrived. People knew their neighbors, doors stayed unlocked, and front porches were gathering places. Children played freely in the streets until the streetlights came on. The corner diner, the local movie theater, the small-town barbershop, they weren't just businesses. They were part of the rhythm of American life. But not everyone shared equally in that promise. Just a few streets away from the freshly painted houses and tidy lawns, millions of Black Americans were living in a very different version of America. In the South, segregation wasn't just a social norm. It was the law. The Jim Crow system dictated where Black citizens could eat, where they could sit on a bus, even which water fountain they could use. Signs that read, "Whites Only," and colored entrance weren't rare. They were everywhere, constant reminders that freedom, in the so-called land of the free, came with boundaries. Black children attended separate schools, with worn-out books and broken desks, while white schools received new supplies and government funding. The difference wasn't invisible, it was enforced. Still, in the face of that injustice, Black communities built strength from within. Churches became the heart of social life, places not just of worship, but of gathering, of organizing, of hope. On Sunday mornings, the sounds of gospel choirs filled wooden chapels, songs rising from deep faith and deeper pain. That music carried the story of survival, of dignity, of people refusing to be silent. In cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, the Great Migration was reshaping the Black experience. Families moved north in search of better jobs and fairer treatment. They found factories and opportunity, but also discrimination in new forms: redlined neighborhoods, unequal pay, and unspoken barriers. Yet even there, progress found its way. Black entrepreneurs opened businesses, musicians filled jazz clubs, and communities created spaces where culture and pride could grow. Back in the suburbs, television became a window into a carefully curated world. Shows like Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy sold an image of America that looked perfect and perfectly white. Few programs showed what life was like for the millions who didn't fit that mold. Representation was rare, and when it appeared, it was often filtered through stereotypes. The real America, diverse, complex, unequal, was happening off-screen. The 1950s were also the dawn of a new sound music that broke boundaries. Rock and roll, born from the rhythms of Black gospel and blues, crossed racial lines like nothing before it. Artists like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Fats Domino took the sounds of Black America and sent them spinning into mainstream culture. For the first time, White teenagers were dancing to music rooted in a world their parents barely understood, and that quiet cultural shift would change the nation forever. While the airwaves filled with music, the streets began to fill with courage. In 1954, the Supreme Court made a historic ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. It declared that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. It was a turning point, the first crack in a system that had seemed unbreakable. But change came slowly and with fierce resistance. In southern towns, white crowds protested integration, and black children faced hatred just for walking into a classroom. In Montgomery, Alabama, a young woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus. Her quiet defiance sparked something unstoppable, a movement that would sweep across the nation. It wasn't about anger. It was about dignity. It was about the simple, powerful idea that a person's worth isn't defined by the color of their skin. Meanwhile, the rest of America continued its march toward modernity. New highways stretched across the country, linking cities and suburbs in ways never seen before. Air travel became a symbol of sophistication. At 30,000 feet, people looked out over a country changing faster than they realized. The Cold War hung in the background. Television ads promised convenience and happiness, and every generation seemed certain that the future would only get brighter. But for millions, the glow of that promise never quite reached their doorsteps. Jobs remained unequal, schools remained divided, and justice was still something you had to fight for every single day. The 1950s were an age of contradictions, prosperity and prejudice, progress and inequality. A country reaching for the stars while still struggling to see its own people as equals. Yet within that tension, something extraordinary was born, the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement. From the quiet strength of a church choir to the determination of young students sitting at segregated lunch counters, America's conscience was waking up. The decade that began with blind optimism ended with a new awareness that the dream wasn't real unless it was shared by everyone. Looking back now, it's easy to feel nostalgic for that era, for the cars, the music, the black and white smiles on TV. But beneath that surface was a story much more complicated and far more human. It was the story of a nation learning, slowly and painfully, that progress isn't about comfort, it's about courage. And in the quiet streets of the 1950s, behind the tidy lawns and the cheerful jingles, that courage was already growing. You could hear it in the songs, see it in the marshes, and feel it in the unshakable hope of people who believed that equality wasn't a dream, it was a promise waiting to be kept. Letting a child sit on your lap while you drove wasn't careless, it was ordinary. Small hands gripping the wheel, a father's foot on the pedals, the road stretching out beneath the morning sun. Suburban streets were quiet, lined with new houses and maple trees that hadn't yet grown tall. Neighbors waved as you passed. No one thought about safety manuals or liability. It was a world that trusted common sense more than regulation, and for a moment, a child could feel 10 years older just by holding the wheel. Inside those houses, bright paint covered every wall, often lead-based, though no one knew the danger. Hardware stores sold it in dozens of glossy colors, promising durability and shine. Parents painted bedrooms, playground rails, and even cribs, believing fresh color meant health and cleanliness. Science hadn't yet caught up with optimism. Warnings about toxins and fumes were decades away. Back then, progress looked like a new can of paint and a weekend spent making your home your own. Morning goodbyes were brief. Children vanished for hours, sometimes all day, exploring the world that lay just beyond the front yard. There were no cell phones, no check-ins, no hovering parents, just an unspoken rule: be home when the streetlights came on. Kids built forts from scrap wood, splashed through creeks, and learned the geography of their neighborhoods by instinct. They knew which yards had friendly dogs and which corners held puddles deep enough to ruin your shoes. Freedom was the default, not the exception. A bicycle was your passport to the world. No helmet, no reflectors, just a metal frame, a pair of wheels, and a heart that wanted to go faster. The sound of cards clipped to the spokes was the soundtrack of summer. You learned balance on gravel roads, learned to fall and get up again without tears. Knees were scabbed, elbows scraped, but pride stayed intact. It wasn't about safety gear. It was about independence. The simple joy of feeling wind on your face and pavement under your feet made you believe the world was yours to discover. After school, playgrounds and empty lots filled with kids. Supervision was rare. Imagination did the job instead. Treehouses rose in backyards, built from old crates and bent nails. They leaned slightly, creaked in the wind, and no one cared. Each wobble taught balance, each splinter patience. Up there among the branches, looking out over the yard, you felt untouchable, the ruler of your small wooden kingdom. Teachers ruled classrooms with the same steady authority. Corporal punishment was accepted, and respect was non-negotiable. A raised eyebrow or the sound of a ruler on a desk was enough to bring silence. Education was structured, patriotic, and proud. Every morning began with the Pledge of Allegiance. Maps showed the spread of democracy, and science films promised that technology would solve every problem. It was an age that believed knowledge and discipline could build character and a stronger nation. But not every classroom looked the same. Across the South, segregation still shaped where children could learn. Black students studied in crowded rooms with second-hand books and worn desks. Heating often failed in winter, and playgrounds were bare patches of dust. Yet within those walls, teachers built something powerful, self-belief. They taught history that included their students' ancestors, and lessons that went beyond arithmetic: courage, patience, dignity. The hope for equality began quietly, one lesson at a time. Neighborhoods everywhere shared one thing: familiarity. Doors stayed unlocked. If you needed sugar or a tool, you simply walked next door. Neighbors watched out for each other's children. A stranger on the block drew curiosity, not fear. Community was the first line of security. It wasn't about locks or alarms. It was about trust. That trust held together streets, friendships, and the small routines that defined daily life. In many white suburbs, prosperity was visible. Lawns were trimmed, new Chevrolets sparkled in driveways, and evening barbecues filled the air with conversation and the smell of grilled meat. In black neighborhoods, the picture was different, but no less alive. Houses were smaller, sidewalks cracked, but there was energy in every street. Churches doubled as meeting halls, barbershops as news centers, and the music, gospel, rhythm, and blues, early rock and roll, flowed from open windows like a heartbeat. By the middle of the decade, American culture was everywhere, in jukeboxes, comic books, and the brand new glow of television. Shows like The Ed Sullivan Show and Leave It to Beaver painted a world of smiling families and neat homes. But that image left out millions. Rarely did a black face appear on screen, and when it did, it was usually a caricature. Still, young people across racial lines were beginning to share something new: music. From church choirs and Mississippi blues came a sound that broke barriers: rock and roll. Chuck Berry's guitar riffs, Little Richard's piano, Fats Domino's voice, they carried the rhythm of change. White teenagers danced to music born in black neighborhoods, and without realizing it, a cultural bridge had begun to form. Daily routines were simple but full. Mothers managed households with precision. Laundry hung on backyard lines, meals cooked from scratch, handwritten shopping lists tucked into purses. Fathers worked long hours in factories, offices, or on farms, returning home with grease on their hands or dust on their shoes. Dinner was the center of the day. Families gathered around tables, said grace, and shared news from school and work. Television waited until after the dishes were done. Modern conveniences were arriving fast. Refrigerators replaced ice boxes, washing machines hummed in basements, and highways spread like veins across the map. Air travel, once a luxury for the rich, was opening to middle-class travelers. At 30,000 feet, people looked down on a country confident in its progress and unaware of its contradictions. In the background, the Cold War cast a long shadow. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills under their desks, believing a wooden surface could shield them from atomic fire. Families stocked canned goods in basements, built backyard shelters, and followed government pamphlets on civil defense. Fear was part of life, but so was faith in technology, the belief that science and industry could protect America from anything. Through it all, change kept whispering at the edges. The Supreme Court's 1954 ruling in Brown v. Board of Education had begun to shake the old order. In Montgomery, a quiet seamstress named Rosa Parks would soon refuse to give up her seat on a bus. And in black churches across the South, young ministers were beginning to speak about justice, not in anger, but in hope. The civil rights movement was taking shape, still fragile, but unstoppable. Meanwhile, suburban growth continued. Car culture defined identity. Drive-ins and diners became social centers. Teenagers, for the first time, had spending money and independence. They bought records, wore leather jackets, and dreamed beyond the world their parents built. For them, the 1950s weren't just peaceful. They were the beginning of something louder, freer, and more connected. By the end of the decade, America stood at a crossroads. The economy was strong. The middle class was thriving, but the nation's conscience was changing. People were beginning to see that the promise of equality had limits, and that the dream everyone talked about wasn't shared by all. Still, when you picture those years, you see the sunlight on chrome bumpers, hear the laughter of kids riding bikes down long streets, and smell the freshly cut grass of suburban lawns. You see families sitting on porches, radio music drifting through the air, and believe, for a moment, that the world was safe. It wasn't perfect, not by any measure, but it was a time when faith in tomorrow felt unshakable. The 1950s were an age of invention and innocence, discipline and denial, a decade that believed it could build a perfect society if only everyone followed the rules. And in the background, a quieter truth was forming, that real progress would come not from rules, but from the courage to question them. Before we start, don't you forget to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us bring more stories from the past to life. The 1950s were a time when the line between childhood and adulthood was thinner than it is today. Kids watched their parents work, talk, and make decisions, and they learned by doing. It wasn't unusual for a father to hand his child a tool or let them help with chores far beyond their years. People believed in learning through experience, even if it meant a few scrapes along the way. In small towns across America, fresh milk came straight from the farm. You could pull up in your car, hand over a couple of dollars, and walk away with a jug filled that very morning. There were no printed expiration dates, no factory seals, just glass bottles and trust. Farmers were proud of their work, and customers knew where their food came from. Health warnings were rare, and regulation was light. It wasn't rebellion. It was normal life in dairy country. Today, unpasteurized milk is a health concern. Back then, it was a taste of home. Inside those same homes, progress had its own hidden risks. Asbestos was the miracle material of its day, fireproof, affordable, and everywhere. It wrapped around pipes, lined walls, and filled attics. People touched it, installed it, lived with it, unaware of what it could do. Contractors praised it, homeowners bragged about it, and advertisements called it the fabric of safety. The truth would take decades to surface, but in the 1950s, asbestos symbolized modern construction, not danger. Houses themselves reflected the times. Cribs had wide slats, no safety locks, no warning labels. Windows opened freely above them, and parents thought nothing of a summer breeze blowing through. Children learned their world through trial and error. A few bruises, a few lessons, and a lot of trust. It wasn't neglect. It was confidence. A belief that most dangers could be handled with care and common sense. In rural areas, hardware stores sold everything from hammers to explosives. Dynamite wasn't a weapon. It was a tool. Farmers used it to clear stumps, break rock, or thaw frozen ground. Buying it required little more than a handshake and a promise to be careful. Boxes of it sat next to fertilizer and rope, symbols of a time when regulation hadn't yet replaced personal responsibility. It wouldn't be until the 1970s that laws tightened and something once ordinary became restricted. Children's play reflected that same spirit of freedom. Toddlers on tricycles rolled across driveways, sometimes just feet from the road. Parents watched from porches, trusting passing drivers to slow down. There were no plastic gates, no reflective vests, no helmets. Tricycles were solid metal, heavy, durable, and occasionally unforgiving. Every dent told a story, every fall a lesson. Boundaries were learned by bumping into them, and independence came with a few scrapes along the way. In parades and local celebrations, safety took a backseat to excitement. Some parents lifted their kids onto the roof of the family car to see better, a front row seat to the marching bands and waving flags. The cars crawled along the curb, the air thick with music, laughter, and the smell of popcorn. It wasn't reckless. It was festive. The idea of risk seemed small compared to the joy of the moment. Today, it would draw police lights. Back then, it drew applause. Household gadgets told their own story of progress. Mercury thermometers were in every bathroom cabinet, their silver beads sliding smoothly with each shake. They measured fevers, but they also fascinated children. Tiny beads of liquid metal rolling across the floor when one broke. Parents swept them up with bare hands, never knowing the shiny liquid was toxic. It was part of a larger truth about the 1950s. People trusted technology without question. If it came from science, it had to be good. Everywhere, that same belief shaped daily life. Plastic was the future. Processed food was a marvel. Advertisements promised that convenience meant happiness. TV dinners, instant coffee, powdered milk, all signs that America was moving forward. For white middle-class families, the 1950s were a golden age of security. But in many black households, the dream was still out of reach. Segregation wasn't just a Southern reality. It shaped housing, jobs, and opportunity across the country. In northern cities, subtle barriers replaced open signs. Banks refused loans. Employers set unspoken limits. And yet, black communities continued to grow, building schools, churches, and businesses that thrived despite inequality. Gospel music filled the streets. Neighbors looked after one another. Hope was both a necessity and a form of resistance. At the same time, science and fear shared the stage. The Cold War loomed large in the background. Air raid drills became part of classroom life, children ducking under wooden desks, believing it might save them. Government pamphlets showed families how to build bomb shelters, and posters promised safety through preparation. It was a decade caught between optimism and anxiety. Yet despite the fears and flaws, the 1950s were full of human warmth. Neighborhoods felt connected. People left their doors unlocked, trusted strangers to return a lost wallet, and gathered on porches as the sun went down. Radio voices told stories, and the hum of lawnmowers marked the rhythm of summer weekends. You could feel a sense of belonging, not because everything was perfect, but because everyone believed it could be. By the end of the decade, change was already visible. The civil rights movement had begun to stir hearts and conversations. Television, once a symbol of comfort, was becoming a witness to protest. Images of marches and speeches started to enter American homes. challenging the illusion of perfection that had defined the post-war years. The 1950s were not as simple as nostalgia makes them seem. They were a decade of contradictions, innovation and ignorance, freedom and fear, kindness and inequality. For some, it was the best of times. For others, a reminder of how far the nation still had to go. But when you think of that era, the hum of a refrigerator, the chatter of children outside, the smell of fresh paint and cut grass, you understand why it still lingers in memory. It was a time when America believed it could build anything, fix anything, and dream without limits. And though history would prove otherwise, that belief, that stubborn, shining hope, was the heartbeat of an entire generation. By the late 1950s, curiosity still came before caution. Things that would cause alarm today were once part of everyday life, handled with bare hands and good intentions. Mercury thermometers still sat in medicine cabinets, their silver beads dancing when shaken, mesmerizing the watch. If one broke, children chased the shiny droplets across the floor, laughing as they rolled like tiny metal pearls. No one thought about danger. It was simply another curiosity in the cabinet, a little piece of science at home. Schools were changing too. A few lucky students walked into hallways with something entirely new: vending machines. They glowed softly, humming beside the lockers, filled with bottles of soda, candy bars, and gum. Dropping a nickel in for a cold drink between classes made you feel the future had arrived. Teachers didn't stop you, and no one worried about sugar or calories. It was simple convenience, a small luxury in the rhythm of school life. By the 1970s, they'd be everywhere. But in the 1950s, those machines felt almost space-age, symbols that progress had found its way into even the quietest towns. Parents, meanwhile, shopped with a different sense of trust. Running into a store meant leaving the kids in the car with the windows cracked. You'd sit in the front seat, maybe honk the horn once, flip through a comic book, or watch people pass by. The sun heated the seats, the air stood still, but no one called the police or thought about danger. It wasn't carelessness, it was confidence. A belief that the world outside was still safe enough to wade in. That same sense of trust filled the weekends. Building a go-kart from scraps was a neighborhood tradition. Wood from an old crate, wheels from a broken wagon, and maybe, if you were lucky, a lawnmower engine to make it fly. Once it worked, you took it to the street, your friends cheering as you pushed off downhill. No helmets, no brakes worth trusting, just laughter and speed. When you crashed, you brushed off the dirt and tried again. It was how kids learned momentum, gravity, and courage, lessons no classroom could teach. Empty lots became fields of imagination. You and your friends would line up bottles or tin cans, competing to see who could knock down the most with a slingshot or a BB gun. There were no safety goggles, no supervision. Parents might walk by, offer a word about aim, then keep going. Responsibility wasn't enforced, it was expected. Rules were few, but trust was constant. When school let out, the streets turned into stadiums. Tackle football games appeared out of nowhere. No pads, no helmets, no referees, just the thrill of the game. Driveways were end zones, cars were timeouts, and every scraped knee was proof you'd played hard. It wasn't safe, but it was honest fun, the kind that made you tougher, faster, more daring. By dinner time, the street was quiet again, and the sound of a screen door closing meant the day was over. Off the field, America was working faster than ever. Factories ran full shifts, typewriters clattered in offices, and the promise of technology seemed endless. Women typed, filed, taught, and healed, finding purpose in a workforce that still didn't see them as equals. Men came home in polished shoes and loosened ties, briefcases setting down beside dinner tables. Evening news played in the background, voices confident, certain, and optimistic about the nation's progress. But progress came with waste. If something broke, a refrigerator, a washing machine, a rusted car, it was hauled to the edge of town or pushed into a ravine. No one talked about pollution or landfills. Out of sight meant out of mind. Children played near piles of discarded metal, turning them into forts or hiding places. It wasn't neglect. It was normal. The idea that the earth itself could be harmed still seemed far away. Beyond the suburbs, small towns were changing too. Main streets began to fade as new shopping centers appeared along the highways. Parking lots replaced sidewalks, and neon signs promised speed, choice, and comfort. Progress came with a parking space. Families drove farther, bought more, and expected life to keep improving. Yet, in the background, another America was forming, one that wasn't shown on television. Black communities were gathering strength, organizing quietly, preparing for a struggle that would soon take center stage. In church basements, beauty parlors, and family kitchens, plans for marches, petitions, and protests took shape. It was a movement built not on anger, but on faith, the same faith that had carried generations through hardship. At the same time, the younger generation was beginning to pull away from the order their parents built. They wanted more than comfort. They wanted expression. Teenagers filled diners, danced to jukeboxes, and listened to music that crossed boundaries. Rock and roll was no longer just sound. It was identity. It spoke of rebellion, of independence, of youth unafraid to stand out. The world their parents built was still standing, but cracks were forming in its perfect white fences. By 1959, America was both confident and uncertain. Families still gathered around dinner tables, but conversations had changed. There was talk of satellites, of Russia, of space, and sometimes, quietly, of justice. Television showed both the dream and the doubt, the smiling families, the booming economy, and the first glimpses of people marching for something more. Looking back, it's easy to see the contradictions. The decade that built highways, suburbs, and schools also built barriers and blind spots. It was a time of invention and innocence, a country learning how to live in the modern world and realizing it didn't yet know how to share it equally. Still, when you picture those final years of the 1950s, you see sunlight on chrome bumpers, children racing home as streetlights flicker on, and families gathered under the warm hum of a television. The world wasn't perfect, but it was alive, brimming with the promise of change, a promise that the next decade would test, challenge, and in many ways, finally begin to fulfill. By the end of the 1950s, the world still carried habits that belonged to an older time. A shotgun behind the kitchen door wasn't a sign of danger. It was routine. In small towns and farmhouses, it leaned quietly in the corner, used for pests or wild animals, a tool as ordinary as a broom or shovel. Children knew not to touch it, at least in theory, and guests hardly noticed it anymore. It wasn't about fear. It was about trust. The kind of trust that came from believing the world around you was simple and safe. Homes were heated by coal or wood furnaces. They worked hard, burned hot, and left behind buckets of ash. Every winter morning, someone carried the ashes outside, scattering them along driveways or into the garden. It kept ice from forming, made the mud firm, and no one asked where it all went when the snow melted. It was just part of the rhythm of keeping warm. A small, practical act that linked every family to the earth beneath their feet. Freedom, even the risky kind, still defined daily life. Riding on the tailgate of a moving truck felt like flying. Feet dangling, wind in your hair, the open road stretching ahead. You waved to neighbors as the world rolled slowly by. No seat belts, no warnings, no panic, just a feeling of belonging, of being alive in a country that seemed endless. Teenagers were learning the world the hard way, through work. Factories and workshops didn't ask for age, only strength. If you were tall enough to reach the controls, you got the job. Lathes, saws, drill presses, tools that demanded respect, but rarely came with instructions. It was dangerous, but it was opportunity. Every cut, every scar became a small badge of adulthood. No one talked about safety laws. They talked about work ethic and how earning your own money made you part of something larger. Out back, nearly every home had a barrel for burning trash. Old oil drums stood at the edge of yards, filled with paper, food scraps, and broken bits of life. You struck a match, watched the smoke rise, and didn't think twice about where it went. The air carried the smell of wood, ash, and yesterday's garbage. It wasn't carelessness. It was routine. The garbage truck came once a week, if at all, and burning was just another way of keeping up. Leftover paint thinner, motor oil, or cleaning fluid, they went the same way. You poured them out on the gravel, watched them disappear into the dirt, and marveled at the rainbow sheen left behind. Nobody spoke of pollution or toxins. The world felt too big, too forgiving, to be harmed by such small things. We didn't yet know how fragile it really was. By 1959, the country stood on the edge of something new. Behind the glow of prosperity, questions were beginning to rise about justice, equality, and responsibility. Science was changing, laws were shifting, and people were beginning to see the world differently. The habits that once seemed harmless were being challenged, and the future was beginning to demand a conscience. The 1950s ended not with a single event, but with a quiet realization that the things we take for granted aren't always as simple as they seem. That progress, for all its shine, always comes with a cost. And that the lessons of the past, even the small ones learned in quiet neighborhoods and dusty backyards, are still worth remembering. We've come a long way since those days. The world has changed in technology, in knowledge, and we hope in understanding. Yet one truth has always remained, that all people, no matter their color, their faith, or the place they come from, share the same heart, the same hopes, the same right to dignity. In the 1950s, America struggled with this truth, a nation divided by laws and prejudice, yet united by the dreams of those who refused to give up on equality. Their courage reshaped history, and their voices still echo today, reminding us that progress is not about perfection, but about compassion. We are all human, each heartbeat a reminder that we belong to one another. The color of our skin, the language we speak, the country we live in, none of it makes us different where it matters most. May the world one day stand truly united, not by power or fear, but by the simple understanding that love and respect are stronger than hate. Here's to a future where every child, no matter who they are, can grow up free from judgment, and where the word human finally means equal.